France's public debt has shattered every ceiling, soaring to over 3.4 trillion, more than 115% of its GDP. For 52 straight years, Paris has not balanced a single budget. The nation that once dictated austerity to Africa through the IMF and World Bank can no longer manage its own books. And here lies the great reversal. The so-called teacher of fiscal virtue is now the patient of financial collapse. Meanwhile, across the Sahel, leaders like Ibrahim Traoré refuse to play by those same broken rules, turning gold, grain, and sovereignty into shields against debt slavery. So the real question is this: is France's unraveling just a European crisis, or the moment Africa finally proves it can stand taller than its old master? Together, let's dive deeper into the story behind France's $4 trillion debt. If you believe Africa must write its own rules, type Africa in the comments and subscribe to join this journey for a sovereign Africa. Let's step into the stage of history where two worlds collide. On one side stands France, once the self-appointed professor of global economics, dictating lectures on austerity, fiscal discipline, and structural reforms. On the other stands Burkina Faso, led by a young captain, Ibrahim Traoré, a nation dismissed as poor but now choosing sovereignty over submission. Their paths could not be more different. Yet today they meet at a crossroads. One drowning in debt, the other refusing to borrow. France's national debt has hit a staggering $3.4 trillion, the equivalent of 115% of its GDP. That figure alone would spark panic if it belonged to any African state. But because it's Paris, the media softens the blow, calling it economic headwinds. The truth is harsher. For 52 consecutive years, France has not balanced a single budget. Not once since 1973 has any French government, whether left, right, or centrist, shown the discipline it demanded from others. The facade has cracked, and the numbers are now sirens of collapse. This isn't just a financial statistic. It's a collapse of credibility. Successive French prime ministers have tried to contain the bleeding, only to be toppled by public fury. The most recent, François Bayrou, proposed $44 billion in cuts, barely a scratch against the mountain of debt, only to be drowned out by strikes and forced to resign. His replacement, Sébastien Leroux, inherits a poisoned chalice, a government that cannot pass a budget without riots erupting in the streets. Paris is no longer the voice of reason. It is the patient in intensive care, with each transfusion of borrowed euros only prolonging the agony. The irony is brutal. For decades, France used the IMF and World Bank as weapons of control over its former colonies. African nations in the 1980s and 1990s were forced to cut healthcare budgets, slash education, and privatize state assets in the name of discipline. Economists in Paris wrote prescriptions that left African hospitals gutted and schools in ruins. Any borrowing by African governments was branded reckless. And yet today, France itself is borrowing not for growth, but for survival, feeding subsidies, pensions, and political promises that produce no development. This is where the contrast with Ibrahim Traoré becomes striking. In Ouagadougou, Traoré has refused to play the old game. He turned away from IMF loans, redirecting gold revenues and agricultural gains into national projects. While Paris borrows to calm protesters, Burkina Faso invests to feed its people. Grain silos, rice factories, and energy projects are becoming the backbone of a sovereign economy. Where France clings to credit, Burkina Faso clings to self-sufficiency. The comparison is so sharp, it feels almost theatrical. The empire choking on its own rules, while the former subject writes new ones. But this story is not just about money. It's about identity. France's debt has become a mirror reflecting its moral bankruptcy. The nation that once enslaved half the world now finds itself enslaved by interest payments exceeding $67 billion a year. more than its education budget. A society once proud of revolutions now revolts against reality itself. And beneath the surface lies a deeper humiliation. The myth of European superiority crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions. Meanwhile, Africa is no longer silent. In Niamey, Bamako, and Ouagadougou, leaders see France's weakness as confirmation of what they have long argued, that dependency is a trap, not a strategy. When Traoré says, "A nation that eats from its own soil will never beg," he is not only speaking for Burkina Faso, he is offering a rebuke to the very empire that once dictated hunger and debt as policy. And in this reversal, we see the emergence of a new chapter. The former teacher has failed the exam, while the student is learning to write the syllabus. The scene is almost poetic. In Paris, ministers argue over deficits, while protesters clash with police. In the Sahel, young leaders debate how to break free from the CFA franc and redirect mineral wealth into industry. One capital borrows to preserve illusions. The other rejects loans to preserve dignity. And for the first time in modern history, the comparison favors Africa. The lesson is hard to ignore. France, the empire that claimed fiscal virtue as its divine inheritance, now stands exposed. Its responsible governance was nothing more than decades of debt rolled forward. Its lectures to Africa about austerity were camouflage for exploitation. And now, as its own people choke on the consequences, Paris finds itself with no moral ground left to stand on. So the question becomes unavoidable. Is this collapse just economics? Or is it the empire finally tasting its own medicine? Drop your thoughts below. The streets of France have become the theater of its unraveling. From Paris to Marseille to Lyon, the discontent is no longer contained to whispers or polite marches. Workers demand relief from inflation, pensioners refuse to carry the burden of higher taxes, and students rage at unemployment that seems to stretch into infinity. What once looked like occasional protests has turned into a rolling storm. Strikes choke the transport system, garbage piles on the boulevards, and clashes with riot police become a weekly ritual. France, the self-proclaimed guardian of European order, is rotting in public view. The crisis at the top mirrors the chaos below. Prime ministers come and go like autumn leaves in the Seine. Each new leader promises reform, but no one survives the fury of the crowds or the arithmetic of $3.4 trillion debt. François Bayrou fell after a failed austerity plan. Sébastien Leroux now tries to balance the books with a parliament fractured and a public unwilling to sacrifice. Every measure to cut spending is met with fire in the streets. France has entered a vicious cycle. Too indebted to spend, too fragile to save, and too terrified to confront reality. Markets have noticed. Credit agencies have downgraded French bonds. Once considered as safe as German bunds, French debt now trades with the suspicion once reserved for southern economies like Greece or Italy. Investors whisper the unthinkable, that France is no longer reliable. The empire that once lectured Africa on responsibility is treated like a risky borrower in its own backyard. The humiliation is financial, political, and psychological all at once. Now shift the lens southward, and the contrast becomes almost unbearable. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré is not borrowing to pay salaries or subsidies. He is building. The new rice factories, grain silos, and gold refineries are not just projects. They are statements. Burkina Faso has chosen to live within its means, to redirect natural wealth into production instead of debt service. Where France borrows to survive the weak, Burkina Faso invests to feed the next generation. In Niamey, Niger has taken the boldest of steps, renegotiating uranium contracts that for decades enriched Paris while leaving its own towns in darkness. French energy giants once dictated terms. Now Niger dictates sovereignty. The profits are no longer siphoned off to light up French cities. They are being claimed to power African homes. Each renegotiated deal is a nail in the coffin of dependency. Mali, too, has chosen rupture. By aligning itself with the Sahel Alliance and moving away from the CFA franc, it is severing one of the last colonial chains that tied its economy to Paris. The decision is not without risks: financial turbulence, diplomatic pressure, and the wrath of Western capitals. But it is a declaration that the future will not be written in borrowed ink. The CFA franc, once a proud symbol of French partnership, is being exposed for what it always was: a leash. The image writes itself: Paris borrowing just to delay the inevitable, while the Sahel invests to cultivate life. The former empire is buying time. The former colonies are buying independence. One feeds a corpse, the other plants seeds. And here lies the climax. France is living through the exact prescriptions it once forced on Africa, but without the courage to swallow its own medicine. When African nations overspent, they were told to slash budgets, privatize assets, and tighten belts. Today, when Paris overspends, it pleads for understanding, blaming unique conditions. The hypocrisy is exposed not in theory, but in headlines, in riots, and in debt auctions. In this reversal, Africa gains something more precious than contracts or gold. It gains confidence. When Traoré stands before his people and says, "We will not kneel to lenders," he is backed not just by pride, but by proof. France, the empire that enslaved with economics, is now enslaved by economics. The student has outgrown the teacher, and the world can see it. So, the question turns back to us. Do you believe history has flipped? That the very Europe, which once mocked Africa for instability, is now drowning in its own instability, while Africa charts a new course of resilience? If you believe it, say Traoré in the comments. In Washington, the alarms are growing louder. Think tanks from Brookings to the Council on Foreign Relations are running simulations, warning that if France stumbles too far, the dominoes could stretch south through Italy, west through Spain, and eventually rattle the very foundation of the Eurozone. The language is cautious in public, but behind closed doors, the anxiety is raw. What if one of Europe's pillars collapses under the weight of its own debt? For decades, American analysts pointed to Greece as the weak link. Now they whisper the unthinkable. France may be the next Greece, only much larger and infinitely more dangerous. Inside the U.S. administration, the debates are sharp. One camp argues that Washington cannot afford to let Paris fall too deep. After all, NATO relies on France as a major military and political anchor in Europe. Another camp insists that America must keep its distance, avoid being dragged into Europe's financial quicksand, and focus instead on its own mounting debt. The split reflects a broader question. Is France worth saving when its economic wounds are self-inflicted? Across the Atlantic in Brussels, the mood is no less tense. France once positioned itself as the pillar of European unity. Now it looks more like a liability. Northern European states, especially Germany, the Netherlands, and the Nordics, are openly worried about being forced to share the burden. To bail out Paris would mean diverting resources from their own voters, and public opinion is already hostile. In Berlin, policymakers remembered the resentment over saving Greece a decade ago. France is not Greece, they say, but the fear lingers that this time the price tag could sink them all. The European Union itself is paralyzed. Some leaders call for solidarity. Others whisper about consequences if France drags everyone into recession. The image of a united Europe fractures when the bills come due. Paris, once the proud architect of EU treaties, is now begging for fiscal leniency from Brussels, a humiliating reversal. Meanwhile, the Western press tries to soften the blow. Instead of collapse, the headlines use phrases like economic headwinds or temporary fiscal turbulence. But audiences are not fooled. The numbers are too stark, the protests too visible. Each euphemism exposes the desperation to maintain the illusion that Europe remains stable while reality says otherwise. And here is where Africa enters the conversation in a way no one predicted. In policy circles, Burkina Faso and the wider Sahel are being studied not as problem regions, but as case studies in resilience. Reports circulate in Washington and Brussels pointing to an uncomfortable fact. Some African nations, despite limited resources, are showing signs of growth without piling on external debt. They are doing what Paris could not. At the center of this narrative is Captain Ibrahim Traoré. African media call him the man who broke the chains of debt. By rejecting IMF loans and redirecting Burkina Faso's gold revenues into domestic agriculture and industry, he has become both a symbol and a strategy. In universities from Dakar to Addis Ababa, Traoré's policies are discussed as a blueprint for post-colonial sovereignty. In European boardrooms, they are studied with equal parts fascination and unease. The contrast is stinging. France borrows to keep the streets quiet, while Burkina Faso invests to keep fields productive. Paris drowns in interest payments larger than its education budget, while Ouagadougou channels its revenues into feeding itself. The hypocrisy of the old narrative, that Europe was disciplined and Africa reckless, is unraveling in real time. Even within American academia, the tone is shifting. Professors who once framed African debt crises as mismanagement now speak of the hypocrisy of Western fiscal culture. If Burkina Faso can say no to IMF loans while Paris is borrowing to survive, who really deserves the lecture? One analyst asked during a recent panel, "It is no longer Africa looking to Europe for lessons. It is Europe, reluctantly, being forced to look south and admit the cracks in its own system." But admitting hypocrisy requires humility, and that is the hardest pill for the West to swallow. So we must ask, do you think the West will finally face its hypocrisy, or keep pretending the old order still stands? Tell us below. In France, the social contract is tearing apart at the seams. Ordinary citizens no longer believe their government can protect them, let alone lead them. Protests have become a permanent fixture, from pensioners demanding dignity to students demanding opportunity. Every corner of society feels betrayed. For years, the state promised stability, but now debt has swallowed entire budgets that once funded education, healthcare, and welfare. $67 billion in annual interest payments, more than the entire education system, hangs like a millstone around the nation's neck. Schools close early, hospitals cut staff, yet subsidies continue to feed a culture of dependency on borrowed money. The once proud republic looks less like a leader and more like a household scrambling to pay its credit card bills. The fracture runs deeper than numbers. French society itself is polarizing. One side demands more state spending to cushion hardship. The other insists the cuts must finally come. Between them stands a political class with no answers, caught between riot shields and balance sheets. The famed French street, once a symbol of revolutionary change, now feels like a battlefield of despair. Trust is gone. Faith in the European dream has eroded. France's future, once assumed to be secure, is now a question mark. Across the Mediterranean, however, the picture is dramatically different. Africa, long painted as unstable, is drawing strength from Paris's collapse. The logic is simple but powerful. If the teacher can fall, the student no longer has to fear. From Ouagadougou to Bamako to Niamey, leaders and citizens alike are asking why they should continue accepting lectures from an empire drowning in debt. Burkina Faso is already putting this confidence into practice. Under Ibrahim Traoré, the country has begun renegotiating contracts with foreign firms, insisting that gold, cotton, and agricultural wealth must serve Burkinabe interests first. Niger is following suit with uranium, breaking decades of French dominance over its most strategic resource. Mali, having cut ties with the CFA franc and joined the Sahel Alliance, now frames itself as a pioneer of monetary independence. Each of these moves signals a broader rebellion. Africa will not be bound by rules written in Paris. At the institutional level, alternatives to the old Western financial order are gaining momentum. The BRICS New Development Bank, Afrexim Bank, and the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, PAPSS, are no longer experimental projects. They are lifelines. They represent a world where African nations can trade, borrow, and invest without passing through the gatekeepers of the IMF or World Bank. The symbolism is profound. As Paris pleads for leniency from Brussels, Ouagadougou and its allies build systems that bypass Europe altogether. The contrast is cinematic. On one side, the lights of Paris dim, streets filled with trash, banners of protest waving under the Eiffel Tower, ministers resigning in disgrace. On the other side, in Ouagadougou, a torch is lifted. New factories humming, fields being cultivated, alliances forming that promise sovereignty instead of servitude. For Africa, this moment is more than politics. It is psychological emancipation. For centuries, European powers thrived by convincing Africa of its weakness, by defining discipline as austerity for the poor and indulgence for the rich. France's debt crisis has shattered that illusion. Africans now see that the so-called masters were simply hiding their own fragility behind borrowed wealth. And if Europe can fail on its own terms, then Africa can succeed on new ones. The shift is unstoppable because it comes from necessity. Africa must rise, not out of arrogance, but out of survival. Climate change, resource battles, and youth demographics make sovereignty the only option. And with Paris collapsing under the weight of hypocrisy, the window of opportunity has never been clearer. So, what began as a French problem has become an African awakening. The continent is seizing the chance to renegotiate its role in the world, to trade dependency for dignity, and to replace shame with sovereignty. The empire may dim, but the continent it once chained is now glowing with possibility. If you believe Africa's rise is unstoppable, type yes. France's $3.4 trillion debt is more than an accounting failure. It is the end of an illusion. The illusion that Europe's discipline was eternal and Africa's destiny was dependence. For 52 years, Paris lived beyond its means while lecturing others about restraint. Now the empire finds itself trapped in the same cycle it once condemned. And yet, this collapse is not just France's problem. It is Africa's opening. From Ouagadougou to Niamey to Bamako, leaders are using this moment to redraw contracts, reclaim resources, and rebuild economies on their own terms. Institutions like BRICS Bank and Afrexim are no longer side projects. They are becoming the backbone of a new order. The balance of moral authority has shifted. When the lights dim in Paris, a torch rises in Africa. Not to dominate, but to declare independence. Not to replace one empire with another, but to end the very idea of empire. That is why France's debt crisis matters far beyond Europe. It marks the twilight of one system and the dawn of another. So what does it all mean to you? Drop your thoughts below. Your voice matters here. And if this story moved you, hit subscribe and stay with us for more.